This next presentation, again, we have such a wonderful spectrum of people working in this space with different unique challenges, and certainly a set of unique challenges is presented when it comes to the work that Gerry Lawson is doing at the University of British Columbia through the Indigitization Project, which definitely wins Best Project Name of the Day. And so I'd like Gerry to take it away and explain some of the work he's been doing. Thank you, Gerry.
All right, thank you so much, and thank the organizers for inviting us here to talk about a project that I'm really quite proud of. And there it is, and Indigitization, the name was there before I got to the project, and sometimes I actually kind of hated it to start with, and then once you've learned to type it, then and once you've trained your all of your word processors to take it, then it's not too bad. So a quick agenda, because I absolutely rewrote this presentation a million times because I haven't spoken to a crowd so far from the source of this project. In general, there's a hook. People know something very specific about the project from some entry point, whether it's library sciences, archival sciences, in the Indigenous perspective, people know something, but being over here, we'll just sort of launch into it, and I'll give a bit of context in a minute. But just to let you know what the Indigitization Project is, it's a toolkit for First Nations communities to help them digitize their own content without ever losing the purview of how it's digitized and who has access to it. We have a and again, losing control of the slide. So it was originally presented as a toolkit, which is basically a group of standards, a few instruction sets on how to digitize things. But the part that really has the most impact is it turned into a grant program for audio cassette digitization. And we fund one cycle per year now, projects up to $10,000, usually about 6 to 8 month projects, and the idea is to give people the basically the groundwork to develop capacities around digitizing cassettes and very quickly developing digital collections so that they can not only get back access to their cultural heritage material, but also have to manage really organized digital collections as a starting point, because I think, as we all know, the born digital landslide is, if it's not here, it's coming. So very quickly, that's where BC is, for those who didn't know. Indigenous communities in BC, I was going to put into some slides from my Facebook feed, but I couldn't contact some of my friends who had the best posts. What I wanted to share with you is that Indigenous communities, we love supporting our professional sports teams. There's an Indigenous basketball tournament that almost everybody from my own community goes to in February of every year. It's called the All Native Tournament. And it's almost replaced warfare as our intertribal conflict. And it's tremendously important. Every community has traditional foods that are almost special to that area. We have Ooligan grease on the Central Coast mainland in Haisla and the Newhawk territory, and in Bella Bella, where I'm from, we have herring eggs, rowan kelp, where people will go out, they'll harvest kelp from the seaside of a group of islands, bring them back, put them in the water, and herring will spawn on them in sheets. And this is something that we actually have a Supreme Court decision that gives us the right to do that every year. Salmon up and down the coast. This is something that continues today, something that if you go to the Museum of Natural History and see their little dioramas of what life was like in 1908, granted, those are awful, but but life is relatively similar with if you add Nike gear and North Face jackets. And what I wanted to get across is that this is not play acting, that culture is life, that it's not a show of activism, it's not some play, it's not doing something for the sake of somebody else. This is just a part of everyday life for my communities. Potlatching is acknowledging births, passing of names, passing of responsibilities within our communities, and that has real lasting value and tangible implications. So, looking at BC, there are a third of the First Nations in Canada are in British Columbia, and over 60% of our First Nations languages are spoken in British Columbia, and that's most of them are exclusive to British Columbia. So the diversity is ridiculous compared to the rest of Canada, where you have larger groups, larger language groups, where archiving and the openness of language becomes easier. And I'll talk about it in another slide later on, but another huge difference is the fact that BC is almost entirely treaty-free. That we had treaties that started in the 1800s and went up through to the 1970s, but most of Canada was under treaty by the early 1900s. And what that means is that for those groups, they actually ceded their land in some sort of agreement to Canada. In BC, that only exists in the Northeast Quadrant, which means that it's in a really weird legal place. And that puts BC First Nations in a really precarious position. Until that land question is decided, access to cultural heritage and to things taken out of context can be used against them and can affect the future of those groups. So about 7 years ago, the museum I work at underwent about a $55 million renewal project that built an entire wing of the building, redeveloped our gallery spaces, what was really groundbreaking in the 1970s, something called visible storage, where most museums have 5% of their objects on display at any time. We had our entire collection on display, except for most of them were in this place called visible storage that were sort of horribly arranged, dark, where you'd have precious sacred objects in with things that they shouldn't be with under some either, type of manufacturer or ethnographic categorization. And what we did was we redeveloped those spaces as the multiversity gallery, and I don't have a slide for that, but we engaged with most of the originating communities to see how they would like their belongings portrayed. And a part of that renewal project was built the lab that I work in. So this is the Oral History and Language Lab. You can see there's a sound booth, recording facilities, and it was really mostly based around born digital, oral history and material culture recordings. And what we didn't count on, I actually worked on the grant about 10 years earlier that ended up building this thing, although it was not associated with the lab at all, was that high quality portable digital audio recorders showed up, and it's really expensive to bring people to Vancouver. So people ended up doing much better recordings in communities rather than trying to, and nobody has programmatic money to bring people to Vancouver to record. So basically the sound booth is used when somebody happens to be on the premise or when I can get into the early stages of somebody's grant cycle. And what I did from my past experience, and a lot of the sensitivities and the understandings that go into the project happened at a place called the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, which is their resource center is the sort of largest Indigenous rights legal research resource centers in Canada. And they have quite a big and varied media collection. And my sister was the head of the resource center. She's an archivist and librarian. And in between gigs, I was on a career change and knew something about computers, and they couldn't afford real technical support. So enter Gerry. So we started running digitization programs, and and when my sister went to UBC to become a librarian at the Waywa Library, Alyssa Cherry became the head of the resource center, and And she inherited me, so we just kept running digitization projects. So then I followed Kim to UBC, and then we stole Alyssa for the museum, library and archives, and one of our colleagues who worked with us there as well, Mimi Lam, is now works in digital initiatives at UBC. So we have this whole sort of training ground of people doing digitization work in a really kind of practical ghetto way, but getting a lot done. And that is still a really special place in terms of collections. And if you do a Google search, they have a tremendous amount of material online. So the Indigitization Project started as a pilot project. And again, I wasn't involved with it. You don't see the MOA logo there. That it was a pilot project funded by the Irving K. Barber Center, which operates on a foundation. It's part of the UBC library system. The information school was sort of tangentially involved, and then 3 First Nations community. The Tanaha, the Helchuk Nation, which is where I'm from, and the Namgis, who are part of the Kwakwaka'wakw people. And this pilot project was quite expansive in that they were looking at helping Indigenous communities to digitize anything cultural heritage. And they refused to define what that meant. So that meant records, that meant audio, video, text, images, literally anything that you could categorize as analog was in the mix. And at this point, my friend Mimi, who I mentioned, was the coordinator for this. So she called me up one day and literally just asked me for recommendations on a set of hardware to lend to communities. And that was just a Pandora's box of that I still claim she knew exactly what she was doing. So just to speak quickly about that, and I'm, again, not sure where my slides are, but you can't just send 10 boxes of hardware to somebody who isn't engaged in audio anything and expect them to put it together, to feel confident they put it together, to know what software to use, to know what formats to digitize to, and know what the workflow should be. So, so as the rest of the project was really expansive and there was good conversations going on, I held this one very close to me. I wanted to make sure that this was a legacy that at the time there were a few very, very basic digitization instruction sets you could download from the University of Hawaii or from a few places that were literally a page, or else there was something like Sound Directions, which is about I think it's like an 80-page tome that only audio engineers can understand. So there wasn't anything in the middle. There was nothing easy for people to download and to refer to. Now onto the slide at hand. The general need, I think most of you know about or have heard about. There's media degrades, like things age, the chemical composition changes, and the equipment that plays it also degrades. There are rubber components that change just sitting on the shelf. So you're kind of in a race, not only with the equipment and not only with the media, but the people who can repair the equipment and the parts. The people who repair the equipment are, when's the last time you saw an electronics repair shop open? They're closing, and the people who repair equipment will still often do it off the side in retirement, but they're kind of dying like our elders. Like, we're literally in the place where the people who know how to use and fix a lot of the older gear, the open reel gear, we're losing. So it's funny, I was at a conference that the Association of Recorded Sound Archivists are doing oral histories with Richard Hess and with other people around how to actually workflows and how to repair and how to use machines, because we sort of know that this isn't communicating fast enough. And yeah, equipment obsolescence is kind of the big one right now. That a lot of the media that's going to degrade has done it in really severe ways, and the other stuff is relatively stable. Although, we can't guarantee that, but the equipment is becoming much more of a problem. The quantity of location of analog media, I'll talk about in a second, but it is literally everywhere in our communities. But it's not just in our communities. Any small to medium-sized community organization, there are family items, city archives reject collections daily. And lack of resources. Not sure what sectors you work in, but within nonprofit sectors, digitization funding generally comes with open access requirements for a certain period of time. And specifically when First Nations communities, that's a complete non-starter. Other digitization funding is only available for certified archives, which there aren't any First Nations organizations I know of that can meet those standards, or there are very, very few. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs could, but somewhere that, had a Masters of Archival Science person on staff was nowhere near that. So, of course, under our conservative government at the time, they cut that funding anyway. So literally the only source of funding for archival digitization in Canada went away a few years ago. So we have had a fantastic new program started at Libraries and Archives Canada recently that enables capacity development within local cultural heritage institutions. So this idea is catching on in terms of the fact that there are distributed collections that are important. And just from personal experience and knowing people within the preservation industry, there was the idea in the early 2000s that there would be these edifices of preservation, that we would have national repositories and archives, and everybody would send their collections to these things, and it would be digitized in a similar way, and standards would be used, and everybody would just give up their things freely, and that hasn't happened at all. So, I think the distributed model is where we're going. So best practices, this is something I admit I haven't revisited in quite a number of years because I've been too busy helping people to digitize. I don't do a lot of research in the area, like we, just based on what you'll see, we have a sort of common set of practices, and we just keep the community growing. But what I found is that when I was doing research, I consider myself a relatively smart person, like not like the other people that you've seen up here, who are crazy smart, but smart enough. And in reading best practices, they're so jargon laden that an average smart person with Google cannot decipher them. And the problem is that archival practitioners take these best practices and adopt them as absolute law. They take things they don't understand, are written for a very specific scientific purpose, but may not actually be feasible within the marketplace that you're looking at, or within the resources that you're looking at. So they're best practices, but they have to be tempered with practicality. And it's not so much about best practices. I call this project a protest project against best practices, but it's not against best practices, it's about the way that they're communicated, the way they're taught, and the way they're adopted within certain sectors. So, and in terms of difficult to measure and achieve, there are things like the speed stability of a playback unit will have a certain measurement, a WRMS measurement, and yes, the manufacturer will have given out those specs at some point, but there's no way of knowing if a 10-year-old machine meets those things. You just sort of blindly accept that your machine meets them if that's what the piece of paper says. And there's literally no cassette tape deck you can buy now that meets best practice requirements. And now to the specific need. Again, the entire province is under land claim legal proceedings right now. I think it was 125% of the province. So you have these overlapping claims between Aboriginal groups, and these claims cause tensions and frictions, and means that even people with similar languages won't share resources across each other. These groups are in a severe state of peril right now in terms of rights and title over land and where things will shake out in terms of the long term. So we're in a point where these communities are not sharing with their information. They can't be politically. So that means they won't give up the provenance of their tapes. They won't give them up. So what you end up happening is that people want to digitize, but they get so frustrated with the way it's presented to them that everybody in these communities is good at something. They are all overworked. They're small organizations in general. There might be one person in an entire office. And they're there for a reason, and they respond to a lot of things. So if there are too many barriers put in front of them on a single thing, they'll just go back to what they do best. So this is some of the types of tapes that are in communities. And again, you have, through various funding mechanisms, structured oral history recordings that was part of multicultural funding in the 1970s and 80s. Starting in the 80s, you had traditional use studies that were part of these land claims, where the government would lend money to the communities. They had to pay it back whenever the land claim or a treaty was settled. But what this adds up to is hundreds and hundreds of audio cassettes with cultural heritage material in every community. And these are communities that are, again, 106 of them in BC, so hundreds in every one of them, if not thousands. And then you have, say, language documentation and open reel that's being repatriated from linguists. And then some of the most important is probably the community-owned tapes. The people who managed to get an open reel recorder in the 1970s and would record on a super slow speed mono in every direction, and so there might be upwards of 16 hours on a single tape. And these are the ones that are going to be conversational. These are the things that the linguists didn't capture. These are the things that our communities desperately need in language revitalization. And that's something that what we're trying to do is enable community organizations to start digitizing, to get adept at it, and to become trusted within their communities so that they can draw out these collections that we know exist, but are largely invisible. They're not counted anywhere. So this is the treaty map of BC. So if you look at all the lines, that's all of the separate treaty processes going on in BC. So indigitization, I've probably spoken a little bit about this now. So what this is really about is, what it's really about is building a community, is taking the barriers out of the way. I'm happy to be a lightning rod for people who want to harp on best practices, but just giving communities a practical set of steps to let them get what I call the most boring part of the process done. We all love digitization. It sounds sexy, a little bit still as a project, but the fact is it's a matter of pressing a few buttons and setting the right parameters. It's not that difficult, but we make it really sound really difficult. So what we want to do is allow anybody to come at it from whatever their passion is. If they're coming at it from language, if they're a young person who's interested in technology but doesn't know about the language, if you're coming at it from an information science background, like whatever your background is, we want to enable you to digitize. So while I was developing the toolkit, the set of hardware and manual for digitizing, my manager, who's our information manager, Ann Stevenson, said, well, you can't do that. You have to give some project planning. You have to tell them a little bit about redundancy and tell them a little bit about workflows. And like, I just wanted to do something that was a bit manageable myself, because this is all off the side of our desks at this point. So yeah, we made a 90-page manual off the side of our desks for audio cassette, which I told somebody at an artist organization once who they deal with nothing but media, and he's like, why? Which artist organizations deal with media daily. This isn't a problem for them. They understand it. They can do it to any quality they want. They can make all the decisions they want. And that's the reaction you expect, is like, why? Why would you do that for such a simple format? But the fact is, there is so much of it in BC, and before we started this project, I would say that a digitization project with, say, 30 tapes digitized was a huge success. We weren't hearing about anybody wholesale digitizing their cultural heritage material. And then you have open reel with older stuff, you have community recordings, you have video, you have everything in these communities, and it wasn't starting. So all we were trying to do was make a resource that people could download and use. It was a pilot project. So open source tools, so you could freely download it. We actually didn't care that it was an Indigenous community. Again, pilot project. Once it's over, you wipe it aside, head on to the next thing, and hopefully that thing stays online for a while. And we have found that there are about 4 projects that that continued on, that actually completely out of our knowledge just downloaded our resources and ran projects across Canada. So Alberta, Toronto, Quebec, and that's really heartening to know that it isn't the best manual ever. It never was supposed to be, but it's better that it fills a vacuum. And so smart people can read it and then throw what they want, keep what they want. And this is where it all started for me. So this is Rory Housty, who I actually think is in New York right now, kind of completely separate thing, and Jennifer Carpenter, who's been running the Helchik Cultural Education Center since the 1970s. And the wall behind them has the remnants of a Helchik traveling exhibit that started at the Royal Ontario Museum. And behind those objects is what they call the vault, so which circles back to one of our other presentations. And when I was probably in my early 20s, I got a tour of the vault when my father, who's one of our traditional chiefs, Himas, was doing some research for a potlatch that was coming up, and walked into a room that it looks like a wall there on the right side, and there's literally just shelves and shelves, like it's a small closet, but on every wall is media. And I thought, okay, I'm talking in front of you, but I was painfully shy as a kid. And I still don't like dancing, so I wouldn't be drumming and singing, and I'm forced to dance occasionally, but it's not my comfort zone. But I thought, this I can do. Someday they're gonna need those things on another format. And so that circled back to a point when my sister was running a resource center, and again, I studied economics and business. I got to sit in between, outside of all the disciplines who took great pride and had won great battles to get where they are and to build these best practices and pick them apart. So at the end of the pilot project, we were just afraid that this hardware kit and this process would go sit in a basement somewhere and never make it to a community. Beyond, I should mention that that is the hardware kit that we developed. It's in a portable rack case with a laptop and a couple of speakers and good headphones, and you open it up, you connect 6 cables, everything stays connected in the rack unit, they're all labeled. We've had dozens of people put it together over the years, and everybody feels confident they've done it right. So I think, if nothing else, that was sort of a coup that we put together something that was easy and people felt good about, people wanted to use. So in terms of breaking down paralyzing barriers, even just hardware that's well thought out is really helpful. And in fact, they liked it so much they bought the kit and didn't send it back. So that kit is still in Bella Bella, and I immediately had to buy another one for the program. So what happened at the end of the pilot project, we went back to the MK Barber, and we were looking for a little bit of money to maybe send it to a community, have it come back, send it to another community, and then if we abandon it there, what's the harm in that? And they countered with $100,000 a year to make it into a grant program from their foundation, similar to the BC History Digitization grant that they run. They saw enough value in the resources and enough it was problematized well enough that they, that we knew we might be asking for a grant, but that number surprised us. And I complain about UBC from time to time, but there's nowhere that I can imagine that I could make that kind of impact in my career as distributing that kind of money to communities for capacity development. And I've talked a little bit about all of this, equipment, capacities, training, and the biggest thing is that this is about developing community. Like, this is not about training specifically. This is about us becoming less important in the process over time. So what we want to do is, and everybody I work with has that same sort of ethic, that we're trying to tell people what we know, but we're at a university. We don't we don't have the same impositions that you have when you're in a one-person office on the Central Coast or in northern BC, when you aren't within a half-hour drive of a pro music store. So, this has to be tested in community, and community has to become its own support structure. And we're not looking to do this forever. What we're looking for is enough critical mass that this will spread virally. And we're certainly seeing a lot of that. And in terms of those community held archives that I was talking about. In every case, people have brought tapes that our own projects have suffered because people have been digitizing tapes for community members. And we're not at all concerned about that. I would also say that the same people who digitize cultural heritage are the ones who supply data to, say, lawyers or other people when there's a resource incursion. And we've had a lot of them in BC. We've had the Northern Gateway, we've had the Mount Poly disaster, which is a mine that the tailing pond collapsed and dumped this slew of horrible chemicals into the river that sustains numerous communities in the Treaty 8 territory. We've got Kinder Morgan. We have just an amazing amount of resource projects, and small communities of 100 people have to respond to these things, and they're given these prospectus and they have to respond within 30 days. So there's no case where the person digitizing didn't have to put aside the project for a little while to go and respond to something that was more important within the community. And again, we expected that. So this is just a shot of one of the training sessions, and these are 3 women from Silcotin National Government. And they're a group that actually borrowed equipment because they didn't, one of our kits, instead of buying it because they didn't have a lot of tapes, and then they got back to their community and found a box with 800 more tapes in it. And then they found more tapes. So they actually have 2 kits of their own that they bought now. And they've been superstars of this project. I think they've digitized all of their tapes, and they came back to us for another project, which we actually don't like to refund because it's capacity development. But what they came back to us for was they wanted to hire an audio engineer to come in and teach them advanced noise reduction. And then they would contribute those processes back to the kit. So they learned the isotope, I think it was RX5 was the version at the time, and they're contributing those processes back to the kit. And for most audio programs, you can buy the plugins from Isotope for about $100. So it's really affordable, and I think they've done noise reduction on upwards of 207 tapes or something last count. And they're going on to transcription, where to transcribe these tapes that are all in some dialect of Silcotin, it takes about a week per tape, I think it is what they were saying, for a person. So it's tremendously onerous, but it's, as most of the information managers know, that's what makes it valuable. It's the processes that happen after digitization that are really interesting. Digitization, again, the most boring part of the process. I still like it, but. So this is one of our training sessions, and this is, Babine Nation, Tahltan, Splatcheen, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Union BC Indian Chiefs. So if you see the redhead in the back, that's Alyssa. And that was, so she was a recipient of the program, and then we hired her away to be our own archivist and librarian. Now she sits on our board, and she's part of the Indigitization Steering Committee. So this is the current partners, and I mentioned in the talk title or the abstract that it's a little bit about resilience. And how do you grow a project like this? Well, there are so many areas you go after something becomes digital. There's the information management, there's transcription, there's any number of things, there's other formats. It's too great for our program to handle all of the growth directions. But one thing that happened is, you see at the bottom, the University of Northern BC approached us after we did a small workshop, and their archives, we basically went up, we trained them on our resources and just said, participate any way you want. And they have relationships in the northeast of BC that we in Vancouver cannot maintain to the same depth. So they have been incredible in that we ran one project in northeastern BC before they came on board, and the next time I think we had 3 or 4 funded projects within their area. And this year is the first year, in fact, starting, I'm gonna go with next Monday, is the training week for Indigitization. So for a full week, I'll be training 6 communities. We're funding 9. 3 will be trained in Prince George at the University of Northern BC, and I'm not going to be involved in that training session at all for the first time. So this is how you become resilient. We expect, well, we may have a budget cut next year, like everywhere else. Fixed costs go up, and your yearly doesn't necessarily. And so what we're doing is we're starting to look for that resilience, grow through bringing on other institutions. I mean, if we got we're one budget cut away from not being a program anymore. And good work does not equal, there's no entitlement to do the work you do. We're so thankful that they've invested this money into what we think is really worthwhile, but there's no guarantee that it's going to go on. And that's happened into so many nonprofits and arts organizations and, you know, countless other types of organizations. So, but Indigenous organizations, if you want resiliency, that's where you look. And it's through partnerships and collaboration and bringing other people on board and doing things together so that if you can't do it for a while, everybody else keeps going and you just rejoin when you can. So this is the map of BC to date, and I don't think that our newest participants are on the map yet, but that represents, I think it's the next slide. It is not. So at any rate, we've given out almost $300,000. I think we've run about 27 to 29 projects. And as you can see, we're hitting a pretty big section of the map. And one of the nicer ones for me is if you look at the island on the left, that's Haida Gwaii. And is one of the most magical places I've ever visited. And it's because they weren't able to participate in the digitization session in Vancouver. So I went up there when they did have free time and trained 2 community organizations at the same time. So somebody within the project and another, the Council of Haida Nations just sent somebody to learn. And so at the end of one of the projects, the Northern Project at Masset, we just sent that equipment right down to the Council of Haida Nations in Skidegate, and they started digitizing. So at no expense to us, you had another project going. And I think that kind of really exemplifies the ethos of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to get things done. We are really uncomfortable with how much money it costs to bring people to Vancouver every year. And we do want to sort of phase that to something else, maybe move it around to somewhere less expensive. But I think I have a slide about okay, so there's Lakebed Beam, okay. So I'm gonna go a bit quicker now. So this is after a project in Lakebed Beam. This is one of the people who got training, who is an extremely busy person, training 2 other people. Growth, we have the partnership, community sharing back. So Musqueam, who actually has 3 Masters of Archival Science on their staff, is sharing back an open and real portion to the manual, and Silcotin is sharing back the noise reduction tools. And last year, which was always kind of a part of the plan, was we wanted to bring people back and get feedback on what we were doing. So we had what's called the Indigitization Futures Forum. And so we went out, raised money, and we brought back, I think, 20 of our previous participants, and there were about 80 to 100 people total at the 2-day conference and workshop, which happened immediately after training week. So that was a bit of a sledgehammer for me. But it was the most amazing gathering, where the people who actually had to do this work in community could come back and tell us, was it working, was it not working, what did they want to do from here, and explore information management and explore all those growth areas that I talked about. And we got some tremendous information from it. Yeah, there we go. That's one of the notes that was taken from it. And that's given us the notion that what we have to do is become an advocacy organization where we find out what's in scope and out of scope for ourselves. We bring on partners, we bring on people who are interested, and have them help us advocate for the funding that's needed for the parts we can't do, and bring the organizations on board who can really take the strides in areas that are too much for us to. And just quickly, Eurocentric systems don't work, approaches and strategies. We're testing something called Mukatu right now, that's out of Western Washington, and it's a CMS that's designed for Indigenous knowledge systems. it will do things like granular access based on gender, time of year, traditional access protocols. And traditional access protocols is something I haven't really talked about, and I've got to wrap it up, but this is, just because you've heard something doesn't give you the right to tell it. But, within all the Indigenous cultures that I'm familiar with, which is mostly the coastal ones, you had an oral tradition and there was a responsibility to the listener. If you listened to something, you had the responsibility of listening properly. And when somebody else told that same story or told that thing, you nodded to say that they had told it right. And it was your job to stand up if they had told it wrong. And if there was a difference in the way people told the story, then that would be worked out. But the onus wasn't just on the person telling it. And just because you heard it doesn't allow you to tell it. And we have a recording within my own community that somebody said, okay, I'm going to tell this story, but I don't have the right to tell it. So afterward he said, well, okay, you can't let anybody listen to it. So, but I'm the last person who knows this. And that's literally, that tape exists. So, what does an information manager do with that? And I'm not asking for an answer, I'm just pulling at a question that it's up to the community. And it'll depend on where the community is in its own healing. So another thing I didn't touch on is, I don't know if you know about the potlatch ban in BC, that the government outlawed cultural practices from 1893 to 1951, punishable by jail, and regalia was taken if people exercised potlatch. So people went to, instead of creating regalia made out of things that were really difficult to make it out of, they started knitting it. So it's a really interesting subculture around it. People didn't stop potlatching, but it was an imposition, to say the least. Residential school, perhaps far more. From, I think it was 1890 something to the last one closed in 1996. So, and Indigenous kids were taken often forcibly from their families and forced to go to church-run residential schools where they were punished if they spoke their language, and taught outright that their parents were, any number of stupid, evil, wrong, bad. So we have a lot of what are called silent speakers, people who know languages but are too shamed to speak them. And it's tremendously emotional. And this is what we're fighting against right now. And this is why things like archival science, where you can digitize something and it takes 10 years in a queue before it's made accessible, we're going to lose the elders who knew the person who was speaking, who can speak to the authenticity or the difference in nuance of maybe they meant this, maybe they meant that. They know people's speech patterns. So for me, we're in a race against time that's not just the equipment, we're in a race to make this useful to living culture, to actually get this material back to the communities that desperately need it, not to somebody in 1,000 years, not a curiosity. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. I have the first question for you, Gerry, and if we have a couple of microphone gnomes, that would be great. Thanks, guys. I'll let you wander. So, Gerry, my first question, and we'll spawn a few, hopefully. I understand that Indigenous cultures really around the world are facing a lot of challenges in conveying their cultures and their languages to the youth of whatever community it may be. Again, all over the world, this is a challenge. Young people tend to like digital media. Has there been a way of leveraging that interest in media to engage more of the community's youths into interfacing with this type of content in their own cultures?
Absolutely. And I would say so much of that goes to the shame and legacy of residential school, alcoholism, and the negative stereotypes about indigeneity that persisted for quite a while. And I think there's this new sense of identity that's coming around, and it coincides with digital tools. And one thing that very germane, within my own community, the community hired a linguist who developed a custom orthography that meant welding on different heads to a typewriter, so that, talking about standards, that's out of standard. So for some reason, that didn't really transfer to a Unicode font. So as part of a project that I'm involved with, and I will say peripherally, with very valued colleagues. They've helped to develop a Unicode font for that orthography. And a young man named Aidan Pine, who's a recent undergrad graduate from linguistics at UBC, is developing converters, or has developed converters, so that everything that was locked in sort of weird true type fonts that aren't standard can be converted to this Unicode, and we're seeing it on Twitter. And Rory Housty, that I talked about, is very active on Twitter and tweeting in Helchuk. So.
All right, let's do just a couple quick. Sally. And can we get a microphone up to Sally, please? Oh, so you know what? Why don't you go first, and then we'll let Sally.
I don't have a question. I just have three things to say. Number one, that was my phone that was malfunctioning before, so I'm sorry. Number two, I'm an avid student and learner of Native American culture and First Nation culture, and I'm involved in shamanic practices right now. So I think the work that you're doing right now is crucial. It's needed. It's monumental. I applaud you, and you're right. It's a race to the finish. You need to do this quickly, and I applaud everything that you're doing up there. It's vital. It's such a significant thing that you're doing. And thirdly, do you take public donations? Because I would love to donate to your cause.
And not at this time, but again, that's what we're working towards. I mean, what we're working towards is, like I said, $100,000 a year. That was unfathomable when it came down. But at this point, we have to start looking at what that trajectory is of digitizing things versus supporting language teachers and supporting getting this stuff into curriculum, which is, you know, another 3 steps of information management to help that happen. So absolutely, we're working towards looking what taking donations looks like and how we accept help from the outside, because the reason I'm here is we spoke at an information architecture symposium that I had no idea what information architecture was. And they were the most welcoming crowd, who offered us graphic design help and user interface help. So we're open for business. We are open for collaboration. And BC has nicely bounded us. Like it's made it digestible for us, and it would have been overwhelming to try to serve Canada or to serve some greater thing. But we're at the point where we can just share our resources in the same way we did with the University of Northern BC. Whatever you want, you know, take it, give attribution, but develop something that helps somebody else, and let us know about it. Let us know if we can help.
All right, one more quickie from Sally, and then.
Hey.
So have you considered, this is such a fantastic model, has there been any discussion, not that you don't have enough on your plate already, to extend that to video formats? Is that something that's ever been thought about? Or?
So that was really, I think the idea was to go to open reel after this, which is exponentially more complex than cassette. You know, we started with cassette because that's where there are tens of thousands of tapes, and it's standard. It's standard from the time it was created in mono. You can put the cassette in, unless you're on a meeting recording that runs at half speed, but it still runs at exactly half speed. You just digitize it, and then in the digital realm, you know, you capture it at twice the frequency. So there are ways to do this in a really, really simple way, and then open reel gets crazy. But video was always, if you digitize things without a time-based corrector, you can run into real problems, which is, I mean, most of you are in media. It's something that just takes a sort of haphazard feed and lets it out in a really time-stable way. And I just bought a little time-based corrector for about, I think, $300 from B&H in New York. So there actually exists something in the consumer level now where we can start to help people to digitize video. But again, you can run an entire 6-month audio program, and one set of preservation masters takes up half of the smallest hard drive you can buy now. And video, you could fill up that hard drive with one crappy VHS tape in uncompressed. So what we have to do is develop practical models for what, you know, we heard ProRes LT as a model. That's not archival, that's not uncompressed within an open container. I don't believe that that's a thing that real people can do. If you're an archivist who has all the money and all the time to do these processes, but you don't have to turn things around and make them accessible, then go nuts. But we have to figure out what that ProRes LT is for Indigenous communities. So yes, absolutely, video is, that may even hop over Open Reel as something we can support very quickly, so.
Gerry, thank you so much for coming out to us today. Thank you.